Welcome to another Airbrush Asylum video. In this tutorial video I'm going to show you how I did this particular skull design on a mannequin's head. So you'll notice here this is what the mannequin looked like prior, and it was based up in a 2-pack black and all prepared and sanded for me. This was done by Aaron from FEC Creative, so he did all the prep and the black, and he also applied the final clear coat once this particular job was completed. So the first step in this tutorial is I'm using white by Trident Airbrush paint. I've mixed this down to my liking with reducer, so whatever works for you. Generally a 1-to-1 mix works fairly well for most people. I tend to over thin it a bit more just so that I get less tip drying, but you just find that happy medium for yourself. And what I'm doing with the white is I'm creating my not only my base color, but I'm also sketching in the skull design that you saw earlier. And as the tutorial progresses, you'll see me render this particular skull design using transparent black, and then I'll come back in with white highlights and then some final black sort of detailing and cleaning up certain areas. So be sure to check out the whole tutorial so that you can see how this was completed. I also show you at the end the rest of the mannequin body all completed, so I didn't put that into a tutorial because that's quite a long process, but I do show you the finished result before it was sent off for its final 2-pack clear. So I do hope that you enjoy this particular tutorial, something a bit different. This mannequin head and this whole mannequin was created for a customer who wants to use this mannequin to promote some clothing. So he is going to take this mannequin with him on certain journeys for promotional purposes and then dress it up in some clothing. So that's why he wanted this skeletal sort of appearance. So the brief was more so to give it a sort of an impact rather than trying to create a photorealistic skeleton. So hence why we've got strong contrasts and some more bolder sort of outlines, just to create that that impact when he's using this particular mannequin for a photo shoot. He also named the mannequin, and his name is Manny Bones Quin, so which I thought was quite fitting. But enough of the background story. We're just starting to detail the teeth area here. So just carefully working the white, mapping in, and effectively using that as my sketch, just to create the artwork and to lay down the foundation of where I want to go with it. I can then come in with the transparent blacks later and eliminate any areas that I don't like, or tweak certain bits if need be. So I'm a little bit further away for the more solid areas. I'm trying to sort of leave parts of the black as well, just so that we already start to get a transition in toning rather than just flat toning the whole head. That's kind of the point of starting with a black base. So you can see here I'm pumping it on a bit heavier to get coverage back over the black. You'll notice that the Trident white does opaque very nicely, so you get reasonably quick coverage. And if you get your mix right, it really does perform like a urethane paint. Sprays extremely well. You'll notice there I've got my own little resin skull that I use as a bit of a reference for this particular project. But definitely lots of fun to render something that is 3D to start with, and just coming in and obviously pulling out all the details. And creating the skull look that I'm after. and that the customer has requested. If this is the first time watching one of our videos, then welcome. For everyone else, welcome back. Thanks for joining us. I do hope that you're enjoying this particular tutorial, and by all means, if you like what you see, feel free to share out this video. I'd also love to have you as part of our community, so feel free to hit subscribe, tap on that bell icon, and that'll notify you every time I put out new content. And I do really hope that this does inspire you to go grab your airbrush and do some amazing artwork yourself. So the airbrush that I'm currently using at the moment is the Iwata CMC Plus Micron. It runs a 0.23mm needle. I have put some links to products that I use in this video in the description below, so if you want some more info, be sure to check that out. So just really applying quite a bit of paint from a distance, just building that up to get my base nice and covered. So keeping that air on all the time, that's going to help dry the paint as I apply more and more coats. And you should, regardless, you should be keeping that air pressed down at all times and just controlling the flow of your paint using your trigger finger. You don't want to start to use the airbrush like a spray can where it's sort of air on, air off. And using the double action technique correctly is very important to minimize tip drying, because keeping your trigger finger pressed down at all times and just using your trigger to pull back for more paint and then return the trigger to its starting position to shut the paint off. If you do that correctly, you will definitely minimize your tip drying, because there's no paint getting stuck in the front of your nozzle every time that you use the airbrush incorrectly. What happens is you're letting go of the trigger and it's allowing that little bit of paint to sort of dry up in the front of your airbrush, and the next time you press down for air, you'll get a splurt of paint that could possibly come out, or it just keeps building and building, therefore creating your tip drying. So using double action technique correctly is extremely important, and something that I always really sort of reinforce to all of my students. So definitely focus on that. Even if it jeopardizes your stroke, then grab yourself a bit of scrap paper and practice. You know, practice the basic techniques. I think a lot of people, they want to go straight into the full-on detailed artwork and doing all these really elaborate pictures, but they haven't yet got their airbrush control dialed in, and that is so very important. So I urge you to do that first and foremost before doing anything else. You'll notice that I've also switched to a transparent black, so that means I've used transparent base. I mix that with reducer first to my liking because it's virtually just colourless binder, and then I add black to that until I'm happy with how dark it is, and then that's what I'll use to render this particular stage. The reason I use transparent black instead of just using black straight out of the bottle and reducing that down is because by adding transparent base to it, it allows for obviously more transparency, because black is usually an opaque color. So that way I'm not jeopardizing all of the detail as I move through the steps and the progress throughout the artwork, especially when building texture, which I'm going to do later on using texture templates. If I was to just then spray back over the top and render with a solid black, a lot of my hard work creating all those textures would be lost. So that's why I talk a lot about using a transparent black, and even other colors I sometimes add transparent base to make them more transparent, just so that I've got a little bit more control over them. So you'll notice that I'm nice and close with my airbrush, controlling it to get that nice sharp edge on the eye sockets. So if you're not comfortable doing that freehand, by all means you can grab like a freehand template, or even cut a paper template to help you to get those sharp edges. And I'm also not just colouring in the complete socket, I'm leaving a bit of sort of detail underneath the eyes, just so that it's not just a flat black. So working in the teeth area now, and again just carefully rendering them. Teeth are usually the more difficult area because you've got to be a bit more accurate with your strokes. Again, this artwork is sort of more of a kind of Day of the Dead style look to the skull face paint mask, so it's not obviously meant to look like a realistic skull. So just shading over some of those areas towards the back of the jawbone there, and that's creating that sense of depth. So really just marking in all the detail. Then I'm going to come in with highlights a bit later on to make it pop even more. I'm also not too concerned if I make a mistake here or there, because I know that I can just come in with my white, eliminate a section and then re-render with my transparent black. So that's the beauty of this particular artwork. I'm sort of mapping it all in, trying to get everything level straight off the bat, keep referring back to my, my 3D skull that you saw earlier, and utilizing that as my guide, and then basically tweaking everything as I go to make sure that both sides line up, they're reasonably level, all that sort of stuff. So you also notice that I'm adding a few cracks and texturing as I go. So predominantly just using freehand airbrush techniques at the moment. I will start to utilize the texture templates later on. But just by spraying the airbrush a little bit unevenly here and there, you already start to get the illusion of texturing, and you're building those particular layers, which is good. So just take your time. Adding some more cracks. Just spin it around and you'll see. So nice and fine, so up close with your airbrush, pulling back on the trigger, and then you want to move as you apply the lines. Okay, so now finished with the transparent black, I'm going to start pulling out some of the highlights using white. So this is also Trident airbrush paint, so just white mixed with reducer, and as I mentioned earlier, it's to my liking, so you basically, whatever brand you are using, whether it's Trident or another particular brand, just utilize their reducer, mix it up to what suits you best, and also what airbrush you're using. That does make a difference. So and just go from there. So you notice here I'm starting to build the texture even further using my white highlights. So just a bit of uneven spraying with the airbrush to create this. You'll notice that my trigger finger is going back and forth, just sort of keeping the air on and paint on, paint off, just to sort of randomly apply that sort of texture. And to do the highlights within the cracks, that's just going up nice and close and keeping the airbrush tight and pulling out some of those areas. You'll notice that the highlights on the cracks aren't exactly perfect. This is intentional so that it gives the appearance of that cracked bone. So you want it to look more organic, you want it to be totally smooth. And another good way to do that is by using a texture template, which you can see here. This particular template is an Art Tool Texture Effects 2 template. So one of the ones that comes in that particular series, and as I mentioned earlier, I'll put some handy links for you guys in the description below, so be sure to check that out. That'll list the templates as well as any of the other equipment that I have used in this particular video. So a good way to get the most out of your freehand templates is, especially when you're texturing, is to lay them flat, obviously, to get a sharp texture. You can also move the template as you're spraying through it, and that'll give you a sort of mottled, more motion texture, which is kind of cool if you combine that with the sharper version. And then you can also lift the texture up from the surface to get a softer texture. So just play around with it, but you can get lots of effects with just one template. You notice here I'm going to just rectify the part of the cranium and work that back over the ear. So then I'll fix up the other side as well, but this is what I was talking about, where you can adjust things as you go. Adding some bright white highlights to certain areas of the teeth just to make them pop. And just doing some tweaks here on the jawbone there. So you can see, just re-sketching it, and then what will happen is I'll come back in with my black and clean that up. So obviously I would use my transparent black to reshape it, because that's going to blend in with the other transparent black that we've used. But then any areas that are going into the base coat black area, they would be then done with a solid black. So those areas I would not use the transparent black to blend that in. So just building more texture using that template again and my white. And now coming back in with some transparent black just to clean up some of that overspray that has been created from using the white, and also I can clean up any of those areas that I've fixed or altered. So you'll probably notice if you've watched any of my other videos that I always do the white as a second last tone, and then I might come in at the end and just do some real final highlights only in select areas. But yeah, the reason for doing it before the last tone is that then the darker tone will clean up any of the overspray that you do usually get from using white. So it doesn't matter how careful you are, you still tend to get that little bit of residual overspray, and being an opaque colour, it doesn't look very good sitting on top of a darker spot. So a few white highlights back on these jaw areas just to rebuild that texture. And then I'm going to switch back to the black. So it's a bit of back and forth as I finalise these sections that I tweaked earlier. So adding a little bit more texture again. This time I'm using my microdot template by School of Realism. And this is just going to give me some of those real fine dots and pitting in the bone of the skull. Okay, so here we have the completed mannequin head. It's just got an intercoat clear on it. This whole project's going to be cleared with a 2-pack matte clear. Some fine cracks in there. The spine. And we have the body, the bones, the hardest thing with this project was to figure out how to position all the bones to make them look effective. This mannequin's for a clothing company. So you notice that some of the ribs, these ones are 3D from the front, but the others run right along the back and join up with the spine. So this whole project, it's more about impact. He's going to use this mannequin for photo shoots. So I do hope that you enjoyed checking out this video tutorial. Until next time, go grab your airbrush, do some amazing artwork yourself, and I'll see you again very, very soon for our next video. Bye for now.